So, Chapter 14 has us addressing students with severe and multiple disabilities. So, what we see is that for children with severe and multiple disabilities, many of them spent their lives institutionalized, really warehoused in places that were initially deemed to be humane, but quickly became warehouses and places where children were not educated and abused. And unfortunately, these were places that flourished throughout the first half of the 20th century. Our children were kept at home or they were actually killed. Um, we start to see, though, that some professional organizations spring up, and the terms that they used at the time we would not use today. They're not seen as politically correct, but these were terms that they were using at the time. So in 1921, we see the National Society for Crippled Children established. Excuse me. As well as, we're missing a lot here. For example, in 1950s, we see a society spring up that is supportive of children with Down syndrome, but there's a long history where we start to see professional organizations as well as parents. It's the parents saying that we need support for our children. Um, it wasn't until the 1970s, though, that public schools first began to include children with disabilities in classrooms, to include children with severe and multiple disabilities. And in 1975, we get our first federal law to educate children with disabilities, and that's referred to as Public Law 94-142, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. And that was very, very important. And it was as the result of parents really springing up and advocating for their children, saying, we pay taxes, we're entitled to have free education for our children. We love them, they are deserving of that. And in fact, we continue to get organizations that support children with severe and multiple disabilities. So what do these children look like? Well, they're girls and boys. They're young men and they're young women, and they want to be accepted. They want it to be included in things. They're students first and foremost, and they have most of the same needs and desires as other children. We may be able to see upon first glance that they have a disability. There's actually no single individuals with disabilities education category, but the category that most fits them would be multiple disabilities or intellectual disabilities, but with a more severe and profound nature. So students with severe and intellectual disabilities, students who are both deaf and blind, and students with many disabilities. Again, just like in other disability groups, we have professional organizations that define the disability. And here we have the Association for Persons with Severe Handicaps definition. And they define this population as individuals with disabilities of all ages, from all ages, races, creeds, national origins, genders, and sexual orientations who require ongoing support in one or more major life activity in order to participate in an integrated community and enjoy a quality of life similar to that available to all citizens. Support that may be required for life activities are things like mobility, communication, self-care, and learning as necessary for community living, employment, and self-sufficiency. So what is the takeaway from this definition? Well, the takeaway is that anyone can have a child with a severe disability, severe and multiple disabilities, and that these are children who are going to need support so that they can be integrated, and they are going to need some level of support the rest of their lives. And the areas that they may need support in, they may need in one or two or all, to include mobility, communication, self-care, learning, employment, self-sufficiency. A low incidence category, meaning we're not seeing many, so 0 to 1%, at most 2% of children with IEPs served. What are the causes? Again, just like any other disability, we have biological causes. A lot of times they'll occur throughout the birthing process. So prenatal, we see chromosomal abnormalities, viral infections, maternal drug or alcohol abuse, malnutrition of mother, and physical trauma to the mother. During the birthing process, we know that lack of oxygen to the baby will impact physical injury to the baby in terms of the brain, as well as contracted infections during birth. Postnatally, we have infections, so occurring after birth, traumatic brain injury to the child, lead poisoning is a big one, reactions to medications, and any environmental conditions. So when we give IQ tests, even though IQ tests really aren't even appropriate for children, some children, but if we were to give IQ tests, these are children that would fall very low along the IQ curve. So an average IQ is 100. Many of us fall in that average range. It goes from 85 to 115, so we fall within that range. Anyone over 115 is really approaching the gifted level. 130 and above is gifted. Anyone below 70 is considered to have an intellectual disability. So these are the children, as you can see, who fall very low along the IQ continuum. They no longer learn, they have difficulty learning and practicing skills. They need concepts presented very concretely. They have difficulty, if you teach something in one setting, generalizing it to another setting. So for example, they may learn to use a communication board to identify that they have to go to the bathroom in school, but you might not see that presented in the home. Academic characteristics, we're really working on high frequency words for these children, such as exit, help, yes, no. Words related to their interests, and of course they'll have interests just like any other child. We're working on language skills. They may continue to be nonverbal because they might, for example, have cerebral palsy that might affect the muscles within their face and their mouth, but they still need to be able to communicate, so they may be relying on assistive technology and communication devices. And again, in the area of math, we're relating their skills have to relate to everyday things that they would use, counting, identification of their address, recognition of numbers, that kind of thing. Social-emotionally, their skills tend to lag far behind those of peers. They might be very, very immature. This is due to a lot of things. They were going to require direct instruction to learn both verbal and nonverbal skills. What they learn will probably not be as sophisticated as their typical peers, but they still desire and benefit friendships. So we might have to, as teachers, really pair up children and support in many ways that friendship opportunity. Behavior characteristics, we know that lack of ability to communicate really results in disruptive behaviors. So we have to make sure that we're providing the child with every opportunity to be able to communicate in the best way possible. Students' physical and sensory impairments may result in self-stimulatory behaviors such as spinning and flicking. So we have to make sure that we're addressing that as well. When we assess a child with severe and multiple disabilities, we're using what's referred to as authentic assessment. So this is a person-centered approach. It's going to focus on the unique characteristics of the child with disabilities. And we're looking at the environment and seeing what the child needs to function best in his or her environment and how we teach the child to function in that environment. So that's referred to as functional ecological assessment. And then portfolio assessment, we're looking at examples of the child's work. So these are all ways in which teachers assess. And we have to make sure that we have to give state tests in Pennsylvania instead of the PSSA, which many of you have taken. These children will take an alternative assessment referred to as the PASA. In early childhood, these are children that generally we know from very, very young age, if not from birth, that they have a disability. So early intervention will be critical. Communication skills is critical. Early literacy skills, critical. Social skills, critical. So all of these things we're working on from day one. Same thing in elementary and secondary ed. The Individual Disabilities Education Act requires that students with severe and multiple disabilities have access to the core curriculum, but we might be modifying that curriculum pretty extensively. So for example, when children are learning about the plant cycle, these children might be pretty much participating in doing the actual planting. Research indicates there are clear benefits of including children with severe and multiple disabilities, so we need to look at practices for successful inclusion. Secondary students benefit from learning social and cultural expectations from their peers, so the modeling and what's appropriate at this age level. And a lot of times what's happening is what's referred to as reverse inclusion. So this is a population that might be more segregated, and we need to have role models and have these children around, typically developing children to the extent possible. In terms of inclusive practices, there's something in the literature and the research referred to as partial participation. So whichever activity or lesson we're teaching, how can we make sure that the child at least is participating at the level that he or she can? We always need extra adult support. Paraprofessionals are used a lot with this type of child, and general and special education collaboration is critical. When we're talking about preparing students for adulthood, we're really talking about that support again, following them through adulthood. So supported employment options, community-based instruction. And these are the children who stay in high school generally until at least the law allows age 21. In some states, they get to stay longer. Pennsylvania is 21. Michigan is 26. So these children can be in school for a long time. The recommended educational practices are meaningful and individualized curricula, collaborative approaches to education, positive behavior support plans, and inclusion. For families, we have to focus on the child's strengths, and the IEP requires us to focus on the child's strengths and to help families with acceptance and participation. Sometimes it's difficult to identify strengths and talents, but we need to make sure that we're doing that. Cultural influences. We need to understand how families from different cultures might perceive disability within their culture. For some, having a disability may be shameful, and we need to understand that and be sensitive to that. Some parents may not share the same educational goals that we believe are important, and so we need to understand that as well and be sensitive to that. The trends with this population and issues, educating students with non-disabled peers to the extent appropriate is important. Using alternative assessments such as the PASA, as well as integrating the delivery of related services. These are children who are going to have a lot of related services potentially. They might have a very large multidisciplinary team, which would include speech-language pathologists, occupational therapists, physical therapists, etc. And that takes us through Chapter 14.